And joining us now for a look at the history of Canada's minority parliaments, Ned Franks, Professor Emeritus at Queen's University. It's good to have you in that chair.
It's good to be here. Thank you.
A few weeks ago, you presented some numbers to the Public Policy Forum in Ottawa that got a lot of people buzzing. So we want to share some of those numbers with our viewers right now on the issue of minority parliaments and what works and what doesn't work. Here is a graphic that suggests the success rate on government bills going all the way back to the early 60s. And you can see in Lester Pearson's time, they got more than 90% of the bills passed that were introduced in his 5-year period. Pierre Trudeau, from 68 to 79, his first chunk of time, we're at 68.5%. And then in his final term, 78%. Mulroney's almost 10 years, 72+%. The Chrétien years, almost 70%. The Martin short time, 60+%. Stephen Harper's first chunk of time as Prime Minister, 8.25% roughly. And then from 2009 on, less than 50% of the bills introduced get passed. Now let's do another graphic as well. You figured out the number of average sitting days in the House of Commons during those times in office. And Michael, let's put these ones up as well. Here we go, starting way back again, this time in the Trudeau days, 163 sitting days, going through the 70s, still Trudeau, 156. Trudeau's last term, 139, boosts back up 163 for Mulroney. Then as we come to the end of the Mulroney years, 115, it's chugging along sort of in an average way there in the Chrétien years. And then here we are now, 105 sitting days in the Harper years. And I wonder if you take the first graphic plus the second graphic, do those numbers to you suggest a decline in Parliament?
Well, there are different factors at work, and the reason behind it isn't that Parliament sessions aren't long enough. In fact, they're a lot longer than they were. The reason is in the bills that they simply don't get through, and part of that is opposition, part of it's minority parliaments.
But if you look at those numbers objectively, you'd say, you know what, this system isn't functioning anymore. Is that a reasonable conclusion to come to?
Well, I think Harper is not fair, really, to take the first one, because he'd just come into government. I mean, if you took the Joe Clark government, you'd get an even worse percentage. I just didn't put it in those tables.
Worse than 8%?
Oh, yeah.
Well, of course, he was there for 9 months. Not enough time to get anything through.
Yeah, Parliament didn't sit very long.
Right.
But then one of the other problems that we've had in recent years is the number of elections. And that affects both the sitting days and the bills, because if you have an election, then everything that's on the order paper drops off.
Dies.
Mm-hmm. It dies like the end of a session. And then every election takes about 36 sitting days out of the year. So in other words, 7 weeks of Parliament's sitting time is consumed with the election. So that's one of the reasons why Parliament's been sitting so little in recent years.
But as you look at those numbers, do you personally conclude something's wrong here?
I have some concern about it, and the concern is more on the sitting days than the percentage of bills passed. On the percentage of bills, if you took the same bill session after session, you'll find a higher proportion. I didn't do that in there because it was really, I wanted to look at it as sessions. But you find a fairly high proportion gets through. On the other hand, I do have some concern that what this shows is that an awful lot of the legislation that gets entered into Parliament either doesn't get through or gets through with a significant proportion of Parliament and perhaps the people in the country opposed to it.
Well, that was going to be the follow-up question. I mean, maybe it doesn't get through because it's not very good and shouldn't get through.
Well, maybe it gets through because Parliament hasn't fulfilled what you might call its education function, that it hasn't educated the people of Canada in why this bill is needed and what should happen in it. Maybe there's a breakdown somewhere in the public relations on bills. Maybe it's because election campaigns in Parliament itself have become so simplistic that they're turning people off.
Okay, but if you go back to the Pearson years, and let's see if I can remember this here. In election 62, that was Deef's last. 63 was Pearson's first, then 65 and 68. They had a lot of elections in those 60s as well.
Well, they did. And
they still got 90% of the bills passed.
Well,
so what's different from then for today?
Now, Pearson had a very real difference, and that was that he was on what we might call it the left-hand edge of the Liberal Party, and the Liberals plus the NDP had a majority in the House, and so they had a natural companion for their major legislation, including Medicare and getting on to the things with official languages and so on. So they had a pretty powerful program, and in fact, in many ways, it transformed the role of the federal government, but it was with the support of the NDP through that period.
Well, in fact, here's what Norman Webster had to say about that era in a recent column in the Montreal Gazette, because it was a pretty important time in our history. Our system of parliamentary government, he wrote, may work most efficiently when a majority is in power, but there are times when minorities do us proud. It is a curious fact that Lester Pearson, perhaps Canada's most distinguished international figure ever, never won a majority from his fellows at home. Part of his trouble was the large and lumpy delegation of créditistes from Quebec hinterland, led by Réal Cahouette, a precursor to today's Bloc Québécois. Despite this parliamentary weakness, Pearson's accomplishments in those few years were astonishing. Medicare, Canada Pension Plan, Canada Assistance Plan, the flag, the Auto Pact, the By and By Commission, and so on. The era was marked by political scandal. Remember the Dorion Inquiry? Actually, I don't, but anyway. And Pearson always seemed to be stepping into something unpleasant, but his actual record is long and distinguished and all achieved with minority support. I think we need more detail here on what was so magic about those Pearson years that allowed so much legislation to get through and so much groundbreaking historic legislation to get through that obviously conditions of which don't happen today.
Well, there was a description of the predecessors of the NDP that they were liberals in a hurry. And in terms of social legislation, Pearson was in a hurry. And so he had the natural companions. But when you look at the conservative minority governments, and there was Diefenbaker, we can ignore 57 because it was an unusual one, but 62, 63, and then Joe Clark in 79, what you found there was that they had no natural companion in the legislature, in the House of Commons. And so they were lonely little petunias, and they couldn't get support.
Well, Webster also points out in his piece that the Pearson Parliament was certainly as fractious as today's Parliament was. Does that matter?
I don't think it was, really, and it did have its moments of fractiousness, and there was sort of a mutual loathing between Diefenbaker and Pearson that was palpable. You could sit there in the House of Commons Visitors Gallery, you could feel this. But I think that the Harper government began with a aggressive take no prisoners and demean the person and put question period in particular at a level of banality and nastiness that I have not seen in the House before.
They would object to that characterization, no doubt.
Well, they might think that they were just telling Canadians what it's like.
But certainly, okay, Pearson-Diefenbaker, that was an extremely strong and fractious rivalry, but if you go forward to Harper versus Dion or Harper versus Ignatieff, Harper versus, I mean, that was pretty tough stuff too.
Well, there's another difference, of course, because with Diefenbaker and Pearson, the House of Commons was not televised, and so there was a more civility simply because the grandstand was a much smaller audience. They also, in those days, the much more of the members of Parliament actually lived in Ottawa and moved their families there. And so they would often have dinner together in the parliamentary restaurant, which doesn't happen now. Their children would go to the same schools. They'd be doing things together in other ways. And there was a recognition that they had a lot in common as members of Parliament. And nowadays, even though the number of sittings is fewer, Mondays and Fridays are largely wasted days in Parliament because most members fly back home for the weekends. And so it's not only fewer sittings, but many of the sittings are less effective. And the members don't have that same fraternal contact of being members of a community of Parliament and being parts of the Ottawa community.
And that matters.
Oh yes, these things all matter. Everything all adds up. If you know somebody, if your kids go to school together, if you actually like each other in the curling rink or something like that, you're less likely to say nasty things about them in public.
Let's go back even further, because the chart we showed goes back to the Pearson days, but if you go back even further, the 1920s,
Yes.
Mackenzie King. I mean, he went
Yes.
through a good chunk of time where he was sitting atop minority governments as well. And then, of course, he goes on to become the longest-serving prime minister in Canadian history. Multiple majority wins eventually. Was there anything about those early minority parliaments back in the 20s that would be instructive for today?
Well, the curious thing is that the balance of power in the minority parliaments was held by the Progressives. The Progressives often claimed that they were not a political party.
What were they?
They were a group of people representing different interests. In fact, when they split up, some of them became Social Credit to the far right, and some of them became CCF on the far left. And they never really did hang together, and they hung separately as well. But they were very interesting because, in another sense, the roots of what we now see in the Canadian Parliament are back there. It's what my professor, Dr. Corey, called agrarian radicalism, of a sense in the farming areas of Canada there's something evil with the cities, and probably in the east as well. And that the Progressives' roots were largely in Alberta, and then following them came Social Credit with that same sort of radical agrarian radicalism in it. And then when the Social Credit disappeared, then came the Reform and then the Alliance. And what we now see in the government has a very strong Alberta ideology in it.
Well, the Liberals have started calling them the Reform Conservative Party now.
Well, they could do that, or they could call them Reform Progressive Conservative Social Credit Party if they wanted. But there has been that strong trend there, which is a very interesting strain, and it's a reformist strain, and at its best it's been one of the most important influences in Canadian politics. And at its worst, it just looks like right wing to me, as pure right wing without much else.
Let's take 30 more seconds before we go join the others. And we hear the expression minority government all the time. You say that's wrong. We shouldn't be saying that. Why not?
Well, because the government doesn't must enjoy the support of a majority in the House. So all governments in that sense are a majority. If they lose their majority on a vote of confidence, they go out. And what is a minority is that no party in the parliament has a majority of the seats. And so I usually call it a minority parliament, but I mean, this is really picking nits.
You're not going to fail us tonight if I say a minority government by accident.
Well, no, I think that's the way most people understand it.
Okay, just checking.
I'm just being disagreeable on it.
You're allowed to do that here. Okay, Professor Franks, thanks for getting us started. Let's
My
go over to the
pleasure.
other side of the studio and join the others.
Thank you.
Okay.